When I arrived at the Electro episode for my Element miniseries a year ago, I titled the video How Electro's Newfound Strength May Backfire on It, in which I lampshaded how one possible side effect of Electro's newfound success is that it runs the risk of tethering them to a specific playstyle or motif, wherein anyone who tried to follow a different playstyle could potentially end up dead on arrival. Looking at the current Electro roster, that appears to be the case. For most of version 3, characters are elevated in strength and subsequent popularity in accordance to how well they could channel Dendro. While this has overall produced a net positive outcome for the one struggling element, it somewhat gave off the implication that the performance of any future Electro units would come almost entirely down to their association with Dendro, leaving no room for alternative choices. This isn't just endemic to Electro. Every element has a meta within itself that affects how we view the strength of a character. For example, many Pyro units are heavily dependent on Vaporize to be successful. However, the central theme of version 4's units has ironically been to break away from conventions by releasing many units with a playstyle of their own, and they've more or less been quite successful at that. Since then, while the element has found a stable presence in multiple high-performing teams, the Electro roster is starting to lose ground as a DPS element, for better or worse, with even Raiden Shogun being used more as an off-field attacker and all of Electro's best units being sub-DPS. We haven't had a new Electro unit released in almost 2 full years. The latest one was Sino in the latter half of 2022. So Clorinde will not only be the first Electro unit we've had in a long while, but she's slated to be an on-field attacker, a rather underexplored section as it's only occupied by Clorinde and Sino right now, and neither have withstood the test of time all that well even with the help of Dendro. Is Clorinde doomed to the same fate of Electro on-fielders being underwhelming, or is she going to continue the trend of version 4 units breaking the mold and allowing for novel gameplay experiences? Today, we'll be analyzing Genshin's newest Electro character, while at the same time revisiting the Electro element as a whole to speculate on its future. I'll give credit where it's due. The fact that Electro hasn't received anyone new in over a year and changed, yet no one really complained or made a fuss about it, serves as a testament to how well established its cast of characters are. Despite not receiving anyone new, that was of little importance to us in light of our existing lineup being more than sufficient. Unlike its past rival Pyro, who is sort of a one-trick pony, the Electro element has gone through many phases in the team-building metagame, beginning with their first mainstream composition Taser, and then came the advent of Vaporize in tandem with Overlord, with teams like Raiden National spearheading that niche. Later, everyone was more or less afforded a lifeline through Quicken or Hyperbloom, elevating just about every Electro character in the game to some extent. Now, it would be disingenuous of me to say that Electro had no market share prior to version 3. Taser was by all accounts a very competitive team, owing in part to the individual toolkits of each character. Prevailing sentiment at the time was that Electro was somewhat underwhelming as an element, but stayed relevant through having a very strong top side. Fischl, Yaemiko, Shogun, Beidou, and so on. Dendro made Electro, the element itself, become extremely valuable, and so not only did the roster have very strong units, but they now could take advantage of the new extremely powerful reactions, much like how Hydro became the best element for having the best reactions and many of the best characters in the game. Dendro was such a massive boost for Electro's DPS floor that the jump between pre-Dendro Electro and post-Dendro Electro was almost night and day. If you had any ideation of making an Electro-themed party, your only real choice was realistically Dendro. Not even Taser could match the sheer force of Hyperbloom and Quicken. Like I said, it was so profoundly impactful that an early team of all 4 stars, Shinobu, Xingqiu, Fischl, and DMC, was competing against or outperforming the likes of Ganyu Freeze. Since then, Electro has been joined at the hip with Dendro, disincentivizing players from going for any alternative prior to Chevreuse expanding on Overload. On the subject of Chevreuse, she has made Overload teams a viable course of action, but most Overload teams are pyrocentric, as in 1 Electro 3 Pyro. So people are saying, oh, what about Chevreuse? She's less of a boost to the element and more just a different flavor of hypercarry. For instance, rather than Bennett and Kazuha, you go Bennett and Chevreuse. She doesn't do that big a favor for Electro as she may appear to. How this has negatively affected the Electro roster was that, for all intents and purposes, success or failure of its characters depends almost completely on whether you can maintain high or consistent amounts of application off-field, causing on-field units like Kuching and Sino to gradually sour in value over time. Initially, players were optimistic about Kuching and by extension Sino, as Electro finally had an offensive reaction that would be more than a match for Pyro's Vaporize and Melt, and while that is objectively true, you can think of this as a rich get richer situation. Everyone did get a boost in damage, but sub-DPS units got an even bigger boost in damage. Kuching and Sino are indeed viable candidates, but the goalpost has moved for everyone, putting them as no more than average or decent at best, certainly nowhere close in pull value or performance to Electro's more prominent characters. It's here that we arrive at the current problem with the element. Electro's overdependence on Dendro reactions to keep up with the meta has made it almost impossible for main DPS units to excel. If they can only be used on field, they're essentially hamstringing themselves for doing so. Just like how Linny and Arlecchino needed so much raw power shuttled into their abilities to free them from the need to rely solely on Vaporize, or just like how Neuvillette and Navia had to have extremely high base numbers to escape their respective elements' expectations, for Electro to have an on-field attacker that doesn't straight up get overshadowed by their off-fielders, they would have to receive the same concessions. Just one issue though, Dendro is a far, and I emphasize far greater wall to climb over than Vaporize, both reverse and forward or mono geo. Dendro is such a massive crutch to Electro at this point that an Electro on fielder, which I'll remind you is already a disadvantage, has to be over-tuned to high heaven to be able to divorce themselves from Dendro. However, why this isn't even the slightest bit a good idea for the sake of game balance is that say you have Koting and Sino who, arbitrarily speaking, have a power level of 1000 each. With Dendro reactions they can reach a power level of 2000. This means for an Electro on fielder to be as good as them without Dendro, they would need at minimum a base power level of 2000. These are just arbitrary numbers for the sake of argument, don't take them as fact. Now in reality, the total would need to be much higher since if you recall, Koting and Sino are nowhere close to having the same value as Fischl, Shinobu, Shogun, and so on, who are likely in the 3000s with Dendro. If you make a new Electro unit with a base power level of 3000, that might allow them to be top tier. You know, right next to Arlecchino, Neuvillette, I'll hate them, etc. without having to rely solely on Dendro. But what's to stop them from just running Dendro anyway and boosting themselves up to 4000, 5000? You could pull a Nilou or Chevreuse and make it so they can only have members of a certain element, but if it has to come to that to balance a character, that's a lack of foresight from a design perspective. This brings us to Clorinde. Clorinde is an Electro main DPS character who alternates between a sword and a gun, and is the second unit to be released with a Bond of Life mechanic. Playstyle-wise, it's awesome that Hoyo's allowing for more dual stance characters who can swap between ranged and melee forms. I thought this would be a regular thing way back when Child came out, but hardly anyone ever makes use of his actual bow whatsoever. Her skill has to make use of her gun, replacing her normal attacks for a short duration. Attacking while in this state will generate Bond of Life up to a cap, and when recasting her skill, she lunges forward to damage all enemies in the way, while consuming all Bond of Life to heal herself the same way Arlecchino does with her ultimate. Overcapping Bond of Life will make the attack range, damage, and healing of her thrust even stronger. An interesting premise to say the least. Clorinde is the first on-field Electro attacker, and really one of the only few on-field attackers overall with the consistent ability to heal herself, making her a very self-sufficient unit. Unlike Arlecchino, Clorinde's healing does not come at the cost of her DPS, which is a huge positive. Not having to worry about healing your main carry opens up the door for potential quad damage teams. That's a nice privilege to have if you're trying to make it as a hyper carry. By the way, has anyone else noticed a recurring theme with version 4 characters? Almost all the attackers place more reliance on their skills or normal attacks instead of their burst. All their burst really does is deal damage, and Clorinde is no different. Just a quick barrage of Electro attacks that fully restores her Bond of Life. And on a side note, the animation is freaking gas. Clorinde's a modern character, so obviously she gets fancier animations, but this has to easily be my new favorite. It is so extra and I love it. On paper, Clorinde has all the makings of a solo attacking unit. For one, she has a self-contained moveset, having no implicit requirements for team members. Her A1 passive grants bonus scaling on her abilities whenever any party member triggers an Electro-based reaction, not specifying that it has to be a unique one, so you can trigger Electro Charge 3 times, Overload 3 times, or whatever 3 times, and that will greatly increase the scaling of her normal attacks and burst, which are pretty underwhelming otherwise. Theoretically, you can field whoever the hell you want, as all that's required to cap out her DPS is to get Electro-based reactions off. But for this to work, she would need to have as much damage output as Neuvillette, and she really doesn't. Clorinde has issues with her kit that eliminate any possible thought of her being a top contender. A hallmark of a top tier damage dealer, especially a hyper carry, is their uptime, how long they can meet at punishment before they need to rest, if they have to rest at all. Arlecchino shines in this regard by having virtually limitless uptime. I'll hate them can stagger his abilities to have rotation times of 12 seconds or possibly more, and even back in the day, one reason people loved using Ayaka was that she could permanently imbue herself with cryo. Nilou teams are great because she will always spawn Bountiful Cores 24/7. There are exceptions, but most characters are known for having rotations that can last well past 10 seconds. Clorinde can't. She has a 7.5 second skill duration and a 16 second cooldown with absolutely no way to refresh it through inherent means. You can use Thundering Fury, in fact I believe the consensus is that TF is the best artifact set, but less than a 50% uptime is almost unacceptable for any self-respecting version 4 unit. Back in version 1 people would have been fine with it, but certainly not when we have a roster stacked with units that have twice the uptime she does, if not more. This severely hinders her ability to be a hyper carry, at least a competitive one. It's also one of the reasons why Shogun hyper carries in each team. Uptime or lack thereof can make or break a unit in that regard. You could make the argument that it doesn't matter if Clorinde has a low buff duration if everyone dies in that amount of time. Which is true, but she's not a front-loaded damage dealer the way Ayaka is, who can ass fuck everything in 5 seconds of their burst. Clorinde is a sustained attacker. Sustained attackers need to have a long uptime. Furthermore, while Pyro can afford to get away with a good time, not a long time, as Vaporize can allow for more front-loaded damage, Electro's power usually stems from continuous repeated damage. Arlecchino can do huge amounts of damage at full Bond of Life, making her front-loaded. Clorinde is more sustained as you want to charge up her Bond of Life before using the finishing blow, but the short duration kind of ruins that. Complicating things further for her is that she just doesn't have the damage to qualify as a hypercarry. Her base kit's indeed commendable, she's no Dia, not even close. However, her A1 and A4 passive alone don't make her that strong. I'm assuming that this was done under the assumption that since Clorinde is able to recover her own HP, you can supplement Elsa with any hypercarry support like Bennett, but Dark Shattering Flame has a hard cap on how much you can magnify her scaling through attack. Because of this, Furina might not appear to be a bad option. Clorinde's own health will be fluctuating quite a bit, so she can accelerate the accumulation of fanfare stacks. But at the risk of sounding like a broken record, Furina was made to be a universal buff to everyone. It's just some units can cap her damage boost a lot faster than others. Clorinde doesn't get that much more out of Furina compared to the rest of the cast, and while we're on that, Furina is better suited for teams with double-digit rotations owing to her skill and ultimate's long duration. Clorinde only stays active for 7.5. In her defense, she has a ton of Electro application even within a short time frame, so you can get lots of Electro procs. But what happens when you have an Electro character with insanely high application? Aggravate.
I am inevitable.
Unfortunately, the only teams you can efficiently use Clorinde in are Dendro teams. She doesn't have enough damage in her kit to ignore the need for it. Some of you might be asking, why is Electro's dependence on Dendro a bad thing? It's not that it's objectively bad, it's just that it kind of oversimplifies the element and makes it too easy to compare units between each other. A bunch of theory crafters have already started calling Clorinde a new Game Plus version of Koting. See, what I appreciate a lot about version 4 is that they make characters who don't subscribe to conventional wisdom and still find success. I understand that Electro's in a really tight spot, being the element all about continuous application, which automatically makes him take a more supportive role and therefore depend on Dendro. But being the first Electro unit in almost 2 years, I thought they would pull something different like they've been doing with everyone else. Pragmatically, Clorinde's a good character, a solid one at that. I don't want anyone to get the impression that I'm calling her trash or whatever. It's just that when I think about what she could have been, I feel disappointed. Clorinde was this close to being the first viable Electro hypercarry. She doesn't have enough sustained, wide-reaching Electro application to be used in Hyperbloom teams, and if she had more base damage or scaling to where direct augmentations would give her more DPS than Aggravate, she could have been so good. Hypothetically, I would have done something like Clorinde, Kazuha, Furina, and Bennett. VV Shred Electro plus elemental damage boost, regular damage boost, and a metric ton of attack. The problem with Electro is that if they can't successfully create units who aren't associated with Dendro, then eventually the roster will get bloated with units who all more or less do the same thing. When they teased her as the main DPS attacker, considering what they pulled off on other units this year, Clorinde feels so... I don't want to say underwhelming because she's not, she's just... whelming. They bounced her with the same power scaling as the sub-DPS counterparts without realizing that as a main DPS unit she needs to have more if she wants to stand out. Even disregarding Dendro for a moment, for main attackers, they should know by now that power budgets have to take circumstance into consideration. They did so for everyone else. I fail to see how they neglected to for Clorinde. I suppose we'll just have to wait for when they eventually try again. All in all, Clorinde is a fine character, but she doesn't do anything to change the Electro roster in a meaningful way. Pull her for waifu over a meta. Otherwise, if you have Shinobu, Fischl, Miko, Beidou, and or Shogun, then Clorinde will add nothing new for your Electro roster. Ultimately, what you're getting is, well, a modernized version of Koting. Fast attacker with high Electro application in a short time frame, who additionally has a few other bells and whistles, but not by that much more to make her worth busting out the old Benjamins for. They definitely need to figure out a way to make Electro stand out on its own and not just piggyback off Dendro until Kingdom Come. One last time, it's not bad that Dendro's carrying Electro, but for the sake of letting every element stand on its own 2 feet, the sooner they figure this out, the better. What do you guys think about Clorinde? Do you believe I'm being too harsh with her, or do you agree with my assessment? Feel free to share in the comments. For now though, if you enjoyed the video, it would be great if you could leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter @Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other new character discussions if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.